Okay, let's get this started. Thank you everybody for joining. We have Lifei here who's joining us from the city far away from where I am. He is in Shanghai right now and 6 a.m. And so he's up pretty early for this talk. When I talked to Lifei, I mentioned to everybody maybe about China is such a potential huge market for many different things, from consumer to healthcare. And I think it's a good opportunity for us to have this conversation to talk about like, what is the myth? What is the bad and ugly? And what is the good thing about, how to access the market in China? And so I thought Lifei will be a good person to have that conversation with. And so today would be like a Q&A format, and then along the way, feel free to type in your question, and then we'll stop our conversation to get a question from you all. So if you can type in your question in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer it along the way. So a little bit background of about Lifei, which I think Lifei is going to talk about soon after, is that he was the Vice President of Business Development and Venture at Medtronic from 2012 to 2018. And then he was also he led the strategic investment and integration of Covidien into Medtronic in China. And he also founded the Medtronic Sequoia China Ventures, a $60 million fund that's dedicated to investment in medical technology and service startups in China, I assume. So, and before that, Lifei also, worked in another large American company. He was heading up the business development at Merck in China, and where he built a cross-function and cross-border team to create a profitable growth through local investment and partnership. And Lifei is not a stranger in this country. He had, a degree here in Carnegie Mellon, and also from Wharton School of Business. So with that, let's get this started. And I'd like to remind everybody, if you want to ask any question anytime, put it in that in the question and answer box, and then we'll answer the question as we go. So I thought before we start, more people probably want to know who you are and what's your background. I did mention a little bit about who you are. If you can tell us.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Christine, for inviting me. So yeah, a little bit kind of personal touch on my background. You can tell I grew up in China, went to Beijing for my college, went to States almost like 20 years ago. I think it was 20 years ago. So kind of my PhD, and I work in the Merck drug company in Philadelphia in R&D divisions. And it's somewhere around 28 when I graduated with my MBA. I kind of feel like I cannot miss China when China was really booming at the time. So I decided to come back to China. So I brought the same two luggage that I brought to the US 10 years ago. It was like start over again. And I joined Merck in China, head up the business development. And later I joined Medtronic in China, which is, that was 2012. So I did a bunch of things in Medtronic, which I really enjoy. A few acquisition investments, a few localization with the Lifei with pacemakers, as well as put together a manufacturing for dialysis in Chengdu, which is a city in southwestern part of China. But I really enjoy was really starting a business from scratch. So I started 3 business literally from scratch. Today has been pretty successful. Last time I checked, a month ago, was $100 million business. So I kind of feel like I'm more entrepreneur than investors. And during that period, I was asked by Jeff to lead integration in Covidien. And I was really inspired by the Covidien venture model, which systematically kind of invest into high growth segments and kind of build a relationship with the entrepreneur. So after that integration, I set up a venture fund with a Sequoia and made about a few investments. But that experience taught me a few things. One is that when I have a first-hand experience working, talking to physicians in China, and really understand what kind of a tool they're using, which is like 20 years old, right? So compared to the tools that you guys will have in the US, for example. So, but they have huge appetites for innovation. They're just, I would say, a huge unmet needs in China. One kind of case point, if you will, for BPH condition, which is very prevalent in China with about 120 million populations. If you look at that, one of the city is I forget, is like Lexington, Kentucky, with a population of 300,000 population. Everybody will have access to Resume, Europe, all the greatest and latest. But in China, if you look at one of the city called Chongqing, it's also near a southwestern part of China, with a population of 25 million peoples. None of them have access to this kind of latest and greatest. They are still using Turk, which is kind of Asians. So that's kind of struck me as that why there is such a unmet needs in China and nobody is addressing them. On the flip side, when I travel to the States, which I do quite often, given my role, I was remember I was driving on a country road, middle of nowhere, and then there's a company working on some of the greatest technology in the world, with a very compelling clinical data. And then I kind of asked myself, why is this company never going to go to China? So this is a kind of a very striking difference if you look at China versus US. So that kind of really motivated me to kind of found the company I'm running today, which is MedTecX.
Mhm.
We're specializing kind of accelerating technology to China, and our mission is really to accelerate patient access to the best value therapies. So that's a little bit background. So I left Medtronic in 2018 and found this company, and then since about 3 years ago, we are now kind of fully fledged companies.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So obviously, with your experience with Medtronic, Vidian, and with Sequoia, you see all the large players are in China, and
Right.
somehow they must think that there's a big opportunity, otherwise they will not be there. And they somehow figured out how to be there. But I think at the same time, many people, like a lot of the startup, is like a bit more nervous, like a lot of the thing they hear. And maybe you can go over a little bit about what are the recent changes that happen in China, like that can make it very attractive for US startup companies in the medtech space to go to China.
Sure. I would say, probably I was 5 years ago, things are very different, right? So China's moving very fast. So, every year is kind of different. But I would say that there's a really a tipping point, if it was, over the last 5 years that kind of make this go to China, make it more sense, right? So one is that there is definitely, the market itself has become big enough, right? So, I remember I was working at multinational. China was one of we call the rest of the world, right? So it's like bottom of the list. But now China is kind of the second largest market. And it's actually, for Medtronic, for example, is like $2 billion already in China.
Mhm.
And some of the business like neurovascular is actually more than half of the global revenue is coming out of China. So definitely the market potential is there, and then it's definitely increasingly become more important. So that's number one. Number two, I would say the China regulatory has really changed dramatically, particularly to encourage innovations. So, for example, the China regulation has adopted ICH standard, so it's become more globalized, unified, uniform to the global standards, which allow more clinical trial, more innovative technology to be accessible to China market. So that was not possible before, right? And then I would say the other things would be there's definitely abundant capital who are, which is very interested in innovation. Because, 5 years ago, everybody's talking about kind of, they call local substituting import, essentially copycats, right? But I mean, since then, 5 years ago, I think now people are really paying attention to innovation, whether it's incremental innovation or truly kind of breakthroughs. So there's capital of both in private space in terms of venture capital as well as public space. With some recent IPOs, there's definitely more capital who are available to kind of invest or fund those innovations. So for those reasons, I think for startup, if it depends on which stage you are, depending on the product, you may be able to tap into China for the market. You may be able to tap in China for development or manufacturing. or supplies, or you may be able to tap into China for capital. So I do see more interest coming kind of this way of some of the company are seriously considering China that probably was not on the agenda before.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned about, before that you see more copycat. And I think oftentimes a lot of the startup, I think everybody is definitely attracted the potential large market in China, but their worries about the copycat. How can they protect what their technology, so that, because we all know China has a lot of the capabilities for doing a lot of manufacturing for a lot of the technology company, and what can prevent them from copying what the startups bring, because they don't have the resources like the Medtronic to protect themselves as much.
Yeah, my advice has been always that while you're playing defense, let's also play offense. Because wherever you go, the IP is always concerned, right? It's not just China specific. It's just worldwide issues, I guess. I do see very dramatic improvement in China environment. Number one is just there's better enforcement, right? And secondly, that it's just because China itself is upgrading their industry, so they're encouraging their own innovation, so they have to defend themselves. Otherwise, nobody will be innovating in China. So if somebody else will copy them. So I do see that that's really organic development I see happen in China. But from outside in, from startup standpoint, there are tactics you can use to protect your IPs, right? So what China would do the same thing, such as file the patents, really manage your supply chain, and keep some of the critical components and supply chain somewhere that nobody else will know, or just diversify your supply chain, and for the things you can do, right? But those are, I consider, more on the defense, because you're still conservative and you still kind of protect yourself. But maybe the better way to do it would be to be on offense, which means that go to China and then really develop your technology and start clinical trial and set a standard, so that other company will have to catch up and set a barrier of entry. So they have to, for example, they have to do a clinical trial to compare to your device if you want to get the registration. That means that you can set a bar and prevent other companies to go after you. So so those are the things that you can do to really be on offense, instead of pretending that nobody will come to copy you. Just go out and be aggressive. So to me, that's my advice: just find a good partner, and either by yourself, find a patent and do the clinical studies and set a standard, and be out there on the market.
The other thing, the offensive part, it does make sense, but I think at the same time, when you're a startup, your resources are so limited, right? And the promise of the US market is pretty strong, and then if they go to China, they have to split their resources, and then there might be an opportunity for somebody to copycat. So then somebody in China copycat, and then they lost the opportunity in the US. So that's not something that they want to do. And how do you address that?
That's always a hard question. It really, that's why I said, it really depends on the technology, the stage of the company, and just your strategy. So I mean, it doesn't work for everybody. So I do think that it works under the following condition. One is that your product has high market needs in China. Sometimes even disproportionate needs in China. So that therefore there's a huge untapped need. You have to kind of create a value, unlock value in the market. So that's the value, right? Then second thing is that while doing, I understand most of startups have to focus on US, right? That's the most important market. But at the same time, think about, can we leverage China for certain things, right? As I mentioned, you can consider China to supply certain components, doing some OEM for some parts, or doing clinical trial. Because one of the benefits that China enjoy over the recent years is that we are not impacted as much, right, by COVID. So it is actually time to do clinical trial in China. And so that becomes less distraction rather than instead it become more kind of a additional resource for the US startup to tap into, right? And another thing is that as I mentioned, it may be good to find a partner, whether it's a strategic or whether it is some VCs or whether it's some kind of a accelerator like ourselves, right? That will help you kind of offload some of the work from your side and really do most of the kind of routine and on the ground, work for you on your behalf in China. So finding the right partner who has the capability also going to help. So there's a couple of things you can do, but I have to say it's not no brainer. So you have to weigh sort of the benefit with your cost. And particularly, I found some of the company who just, let's say they're doing well in the US with the clinical trial, they have some extra capacity to focus on other countries. Or maybe they're about to, they just commercialize the product in the US, they're about to go IPO, now they get more fundings. Maybe there's some point of the time when the startup now have some kind of a capacity or bandwidth to look after other countries. And I would definitely recommend to come to China. So it really depends on a few factors, but I have to say, you have to weigh kind of the cost versus the benefit.
Right. And I think, and when you mentioned a little bit about the clinical trial, I think sometimes in the US population diversity is so different from the Chinese market, but I think there's also Asian market is pretty large too. So that can, Japan, Southeast Asia, they're, I think the biggest population in the world are in Asia. So a little bit about, maybe I'm not as familiar with, Chinese reimbursement. Like in the US, oftentimes technology cannot get the scalable adoption without the reimbursement, without the code, or they're not part of the bundle. How does it work in China? And how can you also bring company that maybe here is, they don't get the reimbursement, but then maybe there's an opportunity in China?
So just the overall macro levels on China has increasingly spent more on healthcare, but still relative to the US is small, right? It's like last time I checked was like 6-7%, whereas US maybe like 15% of GDP. But there definitely are, because there are a rising income, there's more disposable incomes, and there is definitely more emphasis on healthcare, particularly given the COVID. The government is really spending more on treating as well as preventing disease. There's definitely higher awareness. We do see that there's a more both disposable income as well as more reimbursement coverage. But that said, I think for some of the innovative device, I think it probably still would be reasonable to start with a self-pay. So it's more cash, business to start with, and until maybe like years into that, and then you will get a reimbursement. So that's why it's a very different payment compared to US. So that's why if your therapy has, I would say, is very cost effective. So to the level, right, suitable to the income of the Chinese patients, and you probably will just go with self-pay to start, and then later on you may get reimbursement. But it's not, have to say a precondition for you to commercialize the product. So usually, you can get a pretty good traction with the market, and then when you get a reimbursement, you get the broader adoptions. But I do see that, when you even without reimbursement, sometimes the device can sell, 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, or even above. So that's probably good enough for startup, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Let me pause to check if there's any question from audience before I go further with more of my question. One of the question came from one Sarko. How long does it take to register a patent in China from beginning to end? And what is the average cost?
It depends on the stage. I would say typically when you have a design freeze in the United States, you need to do little bit, depends on you go with import or locally made, right? So if the import, you have to wait for the country of origin approval. So that's, US FDA approvals. But if you go through the locally made, you can start, doing some final assembly in China to qualify being local, and then do the, DVT, design verification test, and then clinical trial, and then finally regulatory approval. So usually the process would take anywhere between 3 to 5 years. And the average cost, I have to say, would be around somewhere around $3 to $10 million. But compared to US, right, that's still relatively low. I think that's probably 5 times the cost to do a PMA trials and then get the US FDA approvals.
Okay. So you mentioned a little bit, like filing the patent, how enforceable is that?
Well, I would just say I do see more enforcement. I see um, that company were stopped from going IPO just recently. So there was a news that Medtronic sued a company.
Mhm.
I see that the court is taken seriously of this enforcement because they said they are doing this just even protect themselves, because otherwise if you don't provide that environment, then none of the startup in China will innovate, because they know it's not going to be viable if they innovate and other company copy them. So I do think that there is definitely increasing enforceability. I cannot compare this to other country, but I do think it's almost comparable to other country,
Mhm.
particularly given that China now is a part of the WTO, and there's definitely principle and rule set up, and then they have to be compliant to that. Um,
And so let me go. There's a few more
okay,
questions here.
sure.
I almost feel like it break my flow, but um, question from John Lee: how is the distribution and channel situation in China, and what's the best strategy for U.S. early stage medtech companies to consider in the China business model?
Yeah, the distribution in China has been very fragmented. There's a large number of national, regional kind of wholesaler and distributors. And the China government has trying to reform that in the recent year to kind of cut down the middlemen and kind of be more direct to the hospitals. So I do see, and that's one. Right. The secondly, that we do see more direct to consumer kind of a channel set up for whether it's retail, whether it's online, e-channel. So it's enabled multi-channel kind of distributions. And then the third one is definitely important to have a very professional field force to train the doctors and provide a technical support. So it is multiple kind of a approach that the company have to take. I have to say, for an early stage startup, it would be probably not a good idea to build that on their own. So just because because of scale, the resources, but also I don't advise startup to pick a simple distributor and just kind of hand over your technology, because they're not investing in market development. So that does not work well. I do think that maybe your best chance are, well, certainly if you have more capital, build this on their own, find a good distributor and sales force, or you can find a strategic like Medtronic or local company like Micropore, for example, who has the infrastructure and sales force, or maybe find some kind of a partner that has the capability both in terms of sales marketing and sales distributions, and do some kind of licensing or joint venture partnership. So there are multiple approaches you can take if you're early stage startup. Yeah.
So, which kind of segue to the question that Brian
Yeah.
asked, is that if a company wants a China partner, because I think
Yeah.
that's like you need to have a China partner to get this distribution set up, what will do most or all the product in China should, maybe I should rephrase this, if a company wants a China partner that will do most of all the work in China, should it favor a JV or licensing out their product?
Yeah. I have to say, in my career, I put together 4 JVs and I shut down all of them when I left. So JV is always something that you have to be careful with. I have to say, because it sounds great, right, on concept, but it's not easy. It's really difficult to put together and difficult to run, and you even harder to wind it down. So if it doesn't work out. It work under certain conditions. I would say if you are a pure technology company and looking for a commercial partner, there's a line interest and there's a strong, kind of sustainable relationship. I think that makes sense, right? You're not competing or fighting with each other. But usually that doesn't. The reason it fails is because the marriage got divorced, and the both party want something, want something. As a result, they kind of fight each other. So that's my typical experience. So the licensing tend to be simpler. Since it's contract based, you don't have to set up a company and set up all the administrative process. And so it depends on what you're looking for. As for joint venture, it give you a little bit equity as well as potential upside. If the product has its own potential to go IPO, for example, get exits, Where if it doesn't work that way, I would suggest doing a pure straightforward license and maybe convert to JV in the future if it's necessary.
So I often hear that, everybody, often being advised that, well, you do licensing, distribution rights to China, then make you as a startup not as attractive to potential strategic who might be interested in acquiring them. What do you say to
Yeah.
that? And why do you think that?
Yeah, that's the also very common question and then a very tough question to answer, I would just say. Um, I would say, a few years ago, this is an issue, but recently I do see this become less concern, mainly because most of strategic are doing the same thing, right? When I was a Medtronic licensed the pacemaker technology to a local company called Lifei. So it's just to be able to get the local status and faster approval, and that's the reason. So I would say strategic, realizing the importance of China, they are also looking for partner who can take the product to China and localize them. So the fact that you have a head start in China, you have a trustable, reliable partner will give you, I would say, increase the value in eyes of kind of strategic. But that's the pros, but there's always cons, right? So, but on the flip side, I would say there's a kind of perception that you're giving things away, right? So you have to manage that. So I mean, really the question is how much you're giving away. Is a way for you to get back, right? And then I do think that having flexibility in getting things back could kind of alleviate some of the concern from strategic if the kind of the value you add in an overweigh sort of the risk, and definitely it's worth doing. So there's a way for you to kind of maintain that, have a string attached to your China rights, if you will, and be able to get it back. So I think that flexibility could be very helpful in the event that you get acquired by strategic. But as I said, I do think that there's more benefit now than the cost. So if you structure your partnership in a good way, I do think that risks become less of concern. Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, like when companies doing an acquisitions, they oftentimes want to make the integration easier because integration costs can be really costly, and synergy is so important. And if their startup is doing something in China and the distributors that they are not working with, undoing that can be hard. Is this more is it more attractive if the startup is working a distributor that's already distributing products for strategic that they're working with?
Yeah. So there's pros and cons. I would say depends on who it is acquired. If it's a big company like Medtronic, that's probably true because they do have their own sales force and distribution channel, everything. But I would say there's only like five, I would say even probably not five, like 3 or 4 company that has the same scale as Medtronic, J&J, or Boston. So the other company are to some degree kind of medium size, and they also use distributor anyway. So I do think that if you have a good partner, a good distributor, that could even be helpful for the buyer because they don't have to worry too much about still commercialize that in China. So there's a way to integrate it and without creating kind of challenges. And then it really depends on who the buyer will be and what their intent will be in China. I think it's on some condition it would make sense to have a good partner and distributor, which could be value added. But for other, if it's a big conglomerate or company like China, then maybe this can become an issue to have to integrate. So as I said, so having flexibility in your return, let's say you can terminate the agreement if there's some kind of event change of control. That could be helpful to eliminate some of the concerns.
Okay, so and then the other things that I think mentioned about finding the right partners, I guess that's so important. And coming from a different country and going into a place that is large and they don't speak the language, how do you know if you find the right partner? What are the criteria that you have to look for when you want to partner with somebody in China besides you?
Yes, it's not. I'm not just self-promoting, but I do think that certainly. So define your goal say, are you looking for capitals or market access or development or manufacturing, right? So, and from that point, you can say, well, what approach do you want to take? Do you want to take a pure distribution or licensing, which is kind of contractor based, easy to unwind, or is a joint venture, which is much more committed, right? And then from that point, you say, well, what do you need from the other side, right? So is it capital, the clinical trial development, or is more manufacturing? So and then build your kind of checklist to say, well, who has that capabilities, right? So I do see that oftentimes, the startup come to China, they talk to so many different people, the KOL, the distributor, the CRO, the strategic, then they get lost because everybody tells them a different story. That's why we exist. So we said, well, why don't we take care of that for you? So I think finding a company who has what you need, not all of it, but at least what you need to provide a turnkey solution, it will be very, very important, right? So that's number one. Number two will be kind of look at the track record. So if you have done this partnership in the past and really deliver based on commitment, and that's somebody you can trust and kind of work with. But if it's somebody from nowhere, and I would put a caution on whether that partner can be with you for a long time. So, and also look at their motivation, right? Why they're doing this. So I mean, can they be a trustful partner? Because if they screwed up the relationship, their business model will be will be challenged, versus some company will do one-off deal, which is hard to understand what the motivation will be. So I think it's a couple of factors, is really track record, and you really understand their motivation, and ask yourself, this is a company or person you can work with over the next 10 years, right? So so that's an important question to ask.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why, I mean, I hear stories. I have not experienced that because I have not been wine and dine. I think there's a lot of stories where you go to China, you'll be wine and dine for a lot, which is going to be very attractive, but then you're stuck in that wine and dine and nothing got done. And how do you spot those?
Oh yeah,
so don't waste your time. Because it looks like from the Western, we're like, well, because nobody will go out for dinner with me if they're not interested. But they, there's that unlimited appetite to wine and dine somebody.
That's just maybe the culture. I think Chinese, first of all, they're more polite. They're not direct, so they don't tell you what they really think. Sometimes if you really don't think your technology is suitable, but they just don't tell you, right? Or they just want to be nice to people. So they still invite you to dinner, and then that's one. And secondly, there's just a little bit tensions, kind of a how to say issues, right? There's a little bit lack of attention because people they like what you have, but then the next day they're gonna move on to something else. So there's always some hot topic, right? Things are so dynamic, so they kind of lose their attention. So I think that could be also possible. That's why I feel like you need to build that relationship. For the company we work with, we know them for at least 3, sometimes 5 years. It's really know them well enough, and then so that this is a person you can work with for the next 10 years. It's not easy, but I have to say, but start early. I mean, it doesn't hurt, right? Start early, but don't commit until you feel like this is really the right things to do. So,
right. Yeah. So let's go back to some of the question here. Yeah. Question from Paul Roberts. Several new roll-up Chinese competitors have gone public in my company market. I don't know what that means. They have largely acquired domestic Chinese startups. Will these Chinese companies also consider US startup acquisition? If so, what factors will they consider beside IP and supply chain?
Yes. Yeah, I do see that one of the trend going on. So because I look at the China sector, like 5 years ago was reverse engineer, like copycats. Now I do see the more incremental innovation, cross-border activity. But then next kind of phase I consider is that Chinese company are going to be going abroad, right? So particularly looking for technology as well as the market expansions, because they're backed by the China market, which is huge, right? They're backed by investor who has a lot of deep pocket funding, and they're hungry, right, for innovation and technology. So that's happening. I mean, but in the past it was not quite successful. Like Micropole acquired Right, Mindray acquired I forgot the name, but anyway, so it was not successful because they're deeply rooted in China. Their still mindset is still Chinese, but I do think there's a next generation of entrepreneur. They're more like people who are trained in US and or Europe to have this same mindset. So now they know how to operate in the US as well. So that's also another factor. For the what they're looking for, I would say they're looking for technology that has I would say unique. First of all, the needs in China. So for some chronic disease like diabetes or oncology or cardiovascular, certainly those are very attractive, right? And then secondly, that there's less competition in China. Nobody has to figure out the technology, and this is really unique and differentiate technologies. And third, maybe they're looking for, say, can you also be able to generate the cash in a market like US to kind of be able to offload some of the burden on their side, so they can kind of be able to leverage the cash flow for the future company growth. So there are a few things that I consider. I mean, but primarily the interest is really the technologies, I think. Yeah.
So is that a requirement that means that the company needs to also have clinical trial completed in China, or can it be having a clinical trial more for the US market, and then they say like, well, we want to develop it here in China and take it over?
Yeah. So yeah, I do think that it's a part of the evolution, and they're not going to jump all the way to the breakthrough technology has not proven yet. So that would be interest for a company like Medtronic, who has a global market and they can take a big swing, right? They can, even if it doesn't work out, that's okay for Medtronic. But for a company in China, they're still gonna feel that's a big loss. So I do think that ideally get some kind of clinical data in first human, so that's proof of concept would be very good for the Chinese company to say, well, at least we got the clinical risk to some degree retired, and the technology risk to some degree retire, because it also don't have much at this point, I guess, much patience for kind of scientific project which is still in discovery stage, right, or in the bench, if you will. But they like something to be in clinical, ideally first humans.
So I mean, as you know now, there's a lot of digital, how in the software, and again, one of the things that people always it's not as protectable, and there's how is that something that bring it to China?
First of all, I would say one thing I do notice that for software is hard to transfer between region because it's very localized, right? If you build an app, typically you have to be very customized to the local healthcare. The patient are the preference are very different. So you don't see like Facebook in China, or you don't see Google in China, so or that much, I guess. There's a TikTok, right, in China, which is the start with China, but now moving to US. So I do think it's hard to transfer software because it's pretty unique. It's really customary to the local environment. The underlying technology, maybe it's algorithm, other things are important. So maybe one way to do it is to kind of separate those two, right? So having your server, having your algorithm somewhere in US, which is probably like what those companies like Microport would do, or like Microsoft would do, but then you have your application in China, which could prevent some of the potential, if you will, leak or some kind of a copycat. But that's I don't know enough about software. I can give you only thing I know, but I feel like I do see technology transfer for mechanical catheters and machinery, other things, but I don't see much transfer of the software. So at this point, yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, for I think my understanding, I thought with the Facebook and the Google is because there's certain rule that China enforce that the Google and the Facebook cannot play in the country. So it's more like an interesting, that's why they are not in China, I think. But anyway, that's a long conversation. So let's go to the next question. That's a company talking about your company, which is great. How does MedTech screen and select project for incubation? And what are the base terms of engagement?
Yeah, I think we take a pretty systematic approach, right? So we started with the market needs. So we have been working with both global KOL as well as Chinese KOL to really ask the questions of what are the unmet needs that are interesting or big enough for us to solve, right? So we look after big chronic disease in China, such as heart, pulmonary space, urology, and also, as I mentioned, diabetes and cancer. So those are, really big enough market that has not just a huge sheer number of patients, but also huge unmet needs, right? So, but the technology probably is already ready, not in China, but somewhere else, right? So that's the first criteria. Now, from that point, we really understand the mechanism of action of some of the clinical stage kind of a medical technology that has been validated in a clinical stage. So why is this going to work, and get some proof of concept, right? So that's give us some confidence that this mechanism can work for this disease, and then it meet kind of the criteria of the China market. And then from that point, we do a pretty extensive landscape. We're probably going to landscape anywhere between 5 to 10 companies in that space, and to say, well, what are the technology companies that are meeting the needs, which are the following. One is that it has to be minimally invasive. The Chinese patients tend to avoid surgery as much as they can. They just hate surgery. Somehow they make them nervous, I guess. That's one. The second thing will be, it has to be very cost effective. It's not cheap, but at least it'll be suitable for their income level, right? And third one is that it has to be very easy to learn and easy to operate. So those are the criteria we set aside to compare this technology, and then we work with the physician to pick the one we think are kind of the one that meet the criteria. So and then we talk to a company, and we build a relationship for 3 to 5 years. We don't immediately commit. We'll say we're also very careful picking the right partner. So not maybe exactly sometime 1 year, but I have to say we have to know them for a long time for us to say this is a company we kind of work with. So and same thing, right? They'll do diligence on ourselves, and they believe we're the company they can work with, and then we will set up typically a licensing type of approach or co-development agreement. Sometimes license agreement, sometimes co-development, sometimes joint venture. So this is a typical approach that we can take.
So you mentioned that for the company to work with you, they already have their clinical data proven, and say their clinical study somewhere else. In terms of like what is the earliest stage that you think companies should be, the latest stage that they need to be before they start considering about bringing their technology to China?
You mean the early or late?
The latest, what is everybody, like if it's early, it's too early, but everybody always is too early. What is what is a cutoff?
I think there's maybe a few point that's worth considering. One is that even before you have clinical study, if you have, I would say, some kind of design freeze, right? Pre-DBT, for example, then you're probably looking for China even do some clinical study. So that can be the time for us to consider China, right? So that's one. But you're very early, but you have to find different kind of partner for that kind of stage. But then another thing, as I said, is when you get to first humans, that's where more kind of a partner or fund or strategic will become interested, right? Because they can pursue the product development in parallel in China, right? With some evidence that you already have. So, and then another point would be like when you are just launching a product, you're getting good traction, right? So you're thinking more kind of market expansions. You say, hey, now we're on the good track in the US, and now we're thinking about kind of generate more revenue from other countries. And this is another time, I would say. The reason is that because you're different stage, you have more resources, and your objectives become more cash flow rather than clinical development or funding. So, so this is another point of time to consider. So I would say there's at least 3 points of time that the company could consider China for different reasons.
So the other part that I think I read it somewhere when we talked to FBI agent, I think that was how I got this information from, that the Chinese government are interested in for China to be one of the leaders in the medical technology space. And is there something that the government does that trying to promote that kind of innovation within China? And then what kind of investment that they bring in that maybe company startup can also benefit from that activity?
Yeah. So the government is a very influential in China, as probably you already know. So they're, but they to some degree, right? So there's certain sector they can play a bigger role. When it comes to technologies, I would say the role it tend to be not less, but at least not as maybe as other sectors like financials or maybe real estate or infrastructure. So for healthcare in particular, I think there's a few things they're doing. One is that they really provide, I would say, policy. For example, regulatory reform was one of them to encourage innovations, right? Get fast approval and leverage overseas data, right, to reduce the sample size, so kind of get a fast approval for innovative technology, right? That applies to both Chinese innovative companies as well as global innovative companies. The second thing they do is that provide subsidy, right? So they provide land, facility, space, and then subsidize your infrastructure, so that way you can spend less on those things, rather you can spend more on the clinical development and innovations. So there's on that. I would say that's really the leverage is not much. I would say policy support, regulatory reform, and a little bit kind of grants, if you will, or some other funding from the government to support this. That's why I have to say they had to leave to the company to figure it out. So because their knowledge or the expertise in the space is limited. So they can provide the infrastructure, the environment, but they have to kind of rely on the company to really innovate. So including IP support. So they're building kind of the environment for you to be successful. But I would say they're not like Israel, right? Who's just going direct to give you grants and kind of almost become a funding mechanism for the startup. Here, I don't think that's the case, because the government is taking less role in funding. Rather, they just give you the support so that the startup can be relatively lean, and they don't have to kind of pay a lot of kind of infrastructure costs, I guess.
Okay, so we touched briefly about your firm a little bit. What are the things that make you unique that startup should want to work with you?
That's a pitch. No, I guess I guess it's really I guess it's really just because we are our experience, right? We work both in multinational. We know the standard. We hold ourselves to the standard. How we protect IP, how we think about quality. That's important. So we can understand the same language that a lot of American companies think. So that's important to kind of have the trust and relationship. So that's really important. So the second thing I would say is really because we understand the pinpoint, right? So I can experience. I took a lot, some team to China. We talked to KOL, talk to CRO, talk to dealers, and then government. And then the answer is there's no solutions, right? So there's no single solution. So we kind of said, why don't we do that? So why don't we kind of raise the fund? We build the manufacturing side. We hired a team. We work with the government to provide what I call a sort of turnkey solution. So you don't need to worry about everything. We can, be your partner, take care of everything on your behalf. So that's important to do it. To do that, you need to have the capital, you need to have infrastructure, you have to have very capable team. So we have as of today, 50 people, right? So it's a pretty sizable team already. So that's the second thing. The third, I would say, is because this is our business model. This is how we survive. So I usually joke that we will not be profitable 10 years out. Until 10 years out when your product is successful in China, because we'll invest at the beginning. We're going to invest in manufacturing. We're going to invest in clinical trial, and our only hope is that we can generate good adoption for the therapy. Then we become commercially successful, and at that point in time, we become profitable. So we have skin again to make sure this is workable. That's why we were not going to. Our relationship has to be more than 10 years for us to be profitable. So to me, that motivation is important, right? So I understand why they're doing this. What's the motivation? So that's also important, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we have a few more minutes. Let's go to some of the questions that we have here. Well, this is earlier on the reimbursement side. In the US, some innovative devices company have a hard time if there's no reimbursement. I think I touched on that a little bit. And also if there are ingrained predecessor does China have the same impediments, or maybe is more attractive given self-pay and perhaps an easier time leapfrogging previous technology?
So the question is that would it be benefit to have a predicate in China?
I think the question maybe like some of the company, like some of the technology have a hard time getting reimbursement, getting us traction if there's no reimbursement here in the US. Is that the same way in China?
The first I would say now, I think to start, it would be okay to have self-pay, because there's a rising income from the patient. If your price is reasonable, they're willing to pay out of pockets. I would say, because that's why the reimbursement is probably like half, and then the rest of it is really covered by out of pocket. So I think that's a less concern. But in order to really drive faster adoption, broader adoption, you do need the reimbursement, because that bring your cost down, and you get much more access, right, to some of lower tier city. So to me, that's the next stage. I do think that for first 5 years, and without reimbursement, your company will still be viable, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it's not as maybe as important as the US, because I understand that the US company are kind of geared towards the reimbursement model. So, but when China, I think it's more about value, right? So is your value therapy provided sufficient value that either the patients or the government or the private insurance is willing to pay for it? So that's kind of health economic question. I do think that if your outcome is good and then you're cost effective, people will pay for it. Yeah.
And then, so I assume because there's often, if they're self-pay, maybe the price can be lower, but then the volume might compensate for the overall revenue. Is that how you think about it?
Yes, for sure. I mean, that's why that equation work, kind of in favor of China, because there's just enough of those patients who are suffering this disease, and then they do have good treatment option in the past. Now you provide something unique, address their needs. So I do think that even like 1 million or 5 million population or patient, it will be give you a good start to generate pretty good business to start. So I think that's not issues. Yeah. So the volume is there. It's just a matter of, can you get it sort of the operator and the patient to adopt your therapy. So the question I asked earlier, which is, do you have good outcomes, right? And then is a minimum ways of, do you have a very, very kind of health economics or value for the therapy? And then finally, it's easy to learn, easy to operate. So if you meet those criteria, it's going to take off very quickly. So.
Do you recommend then for some of the startups that
Yeah.
like just forget about the US market because the whole reimbursement landscape is too much work. I'll just go develop product for China market.
Oh, yeah, of course.
To compensate it with the volume, the large volume.
We do see that happening too. So this is an interesting trend, right? I mentioned the Chinese company come out by acquiring asset or technology, but for a startup, the question I asked is, why don't we go to China first, right? So it's just such a expensive process to go through the PMA trial, right? Generate evidence, and why don't we go to China first, right? So and you still can operate as a global company, right? So I do think that's worthwhile. So I mean, if your device has, I call disproportionate needs in China, it's just no winner, right? China is probably even bigger than US. And if you think that you keep the key technology in the US, maybe sort of a kind of group company that hold all the IPs, and then you kind of apply, work on one indication in China to go to clinical study quickly and generate evidence and leverage China for resources such as product development, manufacturing. Why not, right? And then because you keep the option open, you create values, you can leverage China for its advantage, right? Without kind of doing that a lot of things, without have to kind of worry about raising capital in the US, which I know is very difficult, and secondly, to have to pay 20-30 million for the PMO trial. So I do think that the equation has tipped to the point that it will make sense to consider China the first country.
Do you think that China FDA, I mean, because the US FDA has become a lot more easier, or not easier, like workable in terms of working with timeline. Is the China FDA is the limiting factor that make developing product in China costly for them to not consider China as the first market?
I think that China FDA over last 5 to 10 years has really trying to adopt or be comparable to the US FDA. Everything that they're doing is kind of mimicking what the US FDA is doing. So they're hiring a lot of reviewer now. They're actually, as I said, adopt to the ISH standard, and then the data can be kind of leveraged both sides, right? So and also recently they're setting up NAMPA, which is a central government NAPA, FDA in Shanghai, right? So there's a few things they're doing which are encouraging. So I think that's getting better. I think another thing advice I can give to the company is that file your patent and apply for Green China, because once you have that Green China, then what you do is that you can just talk to the China FDA as if you talk to US FDA. You can have a consultation on your clinical trial design before the actual clinical trial start. So which in the past it's impossible because there's no way you can talk to anybody. But now if you have Green China, you're really innovative. You can have a special window for you to kind of engage the China FDA to consult on your product development as well as clinical trial. So I do encourage companies to really apply to Green China as early as you can. So,
yeah. Okay, well, that's great. Now that's conclude our time. Thank you everybody for joining us. I hope that opened up some mind about opportunity in China and find a way how to work with partner that you can trust to bring your technology in China. Maybe there's an opportunity there that everybody wants to explore. So if you want to, anybody wants to connect with you, they can feel free to email me. Be happy to connect you directly with Lifei. That's great. Well, thank you so much. Have a nice
thank you, Christine. Day. Thank you. Happy to share. Hopefully this is going to be helpful. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.